morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be listening from. Welcome to another HRO Today educational podcast. Today we'll be talking about how to drive a culture of diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that's often overlooked by HR is the opportunity to use the other tools you have to create and mold culture to help your D&I strategy. And one of the biggest tools you have is your rewards and recognition program. I'm Elliot Clark, the CEO of HRO Today magazine. We also publish HRO Today EMEA and HRO Today APAC, and we're the hosts of the HRO Today Forum series held around the world. Today we're joined by a wonderful guest, Theresa Harkins-Schulz, who is the Senior Vice President of Customer Experience for Inspirus, a Sodexo Group company. Theresa uses her deep expertise to create long-lasting impact and success. She is an influential pioneer and, by the way, sought-after speaker and thought leader who has led award-winning Fortune 500 recognition organizations and was one of the chief drivers behind the certification of recognition professionals. I'd also like to add that Theresa has been with us on the HRO Today Educational Podcast before. So Theresa, welcome back.
Thanks, Elliot.
So let's dive right into it, Theresa. Let's talk about how to build a diverse and inclusive workplace. And how do you set the stage? If you're the head of HR and you're looking at, I want to have a more inclusive workplace, how do you set the stage for creating that inclusive environment within the workplace for the workforce?
I think it goes back to any time you're looking to do something, whether it's in your personal life or at work, it's important to know where it is that you want to go. So looking at your organization and deciding what do you want diversity and inclusion to look like, what is your vision for this? Ultimately, that is the key driver to setting the stage, is really defining that. And most companies start with trying to define what an inclusive culture is. And there's a couple of different definitions out there around inclusive cultures. But the one that I like and kind of subscribe to is kind of an aggregation of a couple of them. But it's really about providing an environment where employees have the opportunity to do their best work, no matter who they are, what they do, or where in the world they might be working. So when you set that stage and lay out what that vision is, it really starts to provide the forum to build what your culture needs to be and how to create the safe space for employees to behave and bring their whole self to work.
So as you look at, and usually when I'm trying to figure out how to get from one place to another, I just use Google Maps, but this sounds more complicated. So for your managers who are like me, and you're taking them on the journey, if you will, how do you help them really understand and deploy the D&I strategy, right? And how are they, and specifically, how will they use sort of the recognition and, rewards platforms to help deploy that D&I strategy within the organization?
Yeah, I think the first step when it comes to managers, and it's essential to kind of break it down, right? I mean, when you plan a long road trip, you plan where you might take breaks, where you might stop and get gas along the way. And I think it's important in something such as diversity and inclusion that you as an organization also plan for those check-ins and those educational points throughout that manager's journey. So a couple of ways to help managers grasp and understand what their role in this. First, it's about education. Understanding what diversity is. Diversity is a fact. Helping them to know, the differences, what are the organizational goals around diversity, what strategies do they use to bring talent in, evaluate talent for jobs, and ensure that you have a diverse workforce in front of you. And then the next step of that is really looking, separately at inclusion, to helping them understand what does it mean to be or to be a part of an inclusive environment. And then for them, it's really about helping them to create that sense of belonging for their team members. And one of the ways, to do that is for managers to understand not only what that team is going to do, but also who those team members are and what's important to them. There's some simple things that companies do to promote awareness around diversity and inclusion and encouraging the managers to grab on to those concepts. A lot of organizations will feature, heritage awareness months or have specific employee resource groups that are out there. So encouraging managers to embrace and educate themselves on what is available within the workplace can help them to better understand what tools are out there for their employees. The other part of that for managers is, in addition to sense of belonging, is really just to empower their people and to give their team members the courage to take risks and to also let themselves as managers be vulnerable in taking risks. One of the things that a lot of people are very hesitant to do sometimes, especially if they know or recognize that one of their team members has beliefs that are different than they personally hold, is they're gun shy oftentimes about asking that individual about their, personal beliefs. Could be cultural, could be religious, but just the sheer fact of them asking for that information and educating themselves and understanding a little bit more really helps to start to break down those barriers and drive towards that inclusive environment. So those are some of the things that managers can do to help break down and the steps, that an organization can plan. So I would, boil it down to awareness, education, and then identifying some of those behaviors in the way that you want leaders to engage with their employees and how to go about that.
So once the managers understand how to have that kind of conversation, part of, and I noticed you left off, like the most dangerous conversation to have is to ask someone, Democrat or Republican, because nowadays that explodes, right? Tory or Labor. It's all over the world, right? So let's stick to the easy stuff like religious beliefs and gender opinions and whatever. But if you think about it, what's the role in helping the manager sort of unwind that? What's the role of that unconscious bias on the part of the manager? Because it's not only reticence. You want to make sure they aren't already creating some pre-existing perceptions based on that. And what do you do how do you manage that? What do you recommend to your clients?
Yeah, unconscious bias is really, it's a tricky subject, and the top piece to that is really for managers and leaders and for us as individuals to really understand where those biases may exist. Understanding what they are, understanding the different perspectives of others, and being able to listen for an understanding. It's not listening to respond. It's not listening to react. It's not, listening to take action. It's really to empathize, with the understanding that you appreciate the other person's perspective. So a lot of organizations really drive at taking and understanding the individuals, what those unconscious biases are, and really helping them facilitate as part of, different discussions where those barriers might exist and how they can work together to break them down.
So once you've gotten through that, and you've done this before with me, my whole thing is that's great, but how do you measure it, right? So once you've gotten the strategy in place, the managers are trained, and they're all on board, they're willing to take the journey with HR and the executive team on creating the culture. How are you going to measure effectiveness, impact, success as you move through now the steps in that journey?
Yeah, so when it comes to measurement, I like to peel it back to Dr. Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of learning. I think that model is one that can be used in multiple different ways in the workplace to measure. And just my quick, way to remember that is run, little boy, run, reaction, learning, behavior, and result. So if you look at those 4 different levels that are part of Kirkpatrick's model in the training world, looking at direct reaction and understanding what people's, maybe it's a pulse survey, right? They come into training, how do they feel before they come, how do they feel after they've attended a training or learned a new skill? That's generally where a lot of people start. As you move through that and you look at understanding how they have applied those learnings, that takes a little bit more effort, really interviewing the individuals that maybe have participated or are trying to create an inclusive workplace, where they're at in that journey, how they apply that feedback is really important. The third component of that model is really about, cultivating behaviors. And this is oftentimes where the connection with recognition comes into play. Cultivating behaviors and measuring behaviors is really about observations. A lot of organizations and HR models will utilize 360s, to observe what is important. How do people demonstrate certain values? Looking at them through the lens of competencies. And that's another key way to look at and identify, what people are doing. The last aspect is really around results, right? How do we quantify? We've got these programs, we've got, all of these trainings in place. How do we quantify what the ROI is of that strategy or that effort? And, I think this is where it really gets into, looking at linking both performance and the financial aspects of the organization to understand how diversity and inclusion is making an impact in that workplace. So, whether it's Sodexo, who's done a number of studies on diversity and inclusion, one specifically around gender balance. McKinsey has done a couple of different studies around why diversity matters. And all of those studies find a positive correlation between the executive team gender diversity as well as the financial, performance. They look at those results and they're able to correlate. They have a higher engagement, 11% better retention, and 84% better gross margin. So my encouragement on the metric front is to start small, but to not shy away from looking at the bigger picture of what your organization is doing and what those impacts are in the financial performance within those teams, and how you can link it back to whether it's recognition, engagement, or diversity and inclusion strategies and approaches that you may have within your organization.
It is interesting, and I think you touch on an important point here. A lot of people, when they think about diversity and inclusion, focus on the diversity side. And your point's well taken that you need to have diversity in your leadership team before you preach to the masses, in a sense. And we all know that, at least on the gender diversity, as you go up the organizational chart to the board level, there's a lot of work left to be done. But if you think about it, diversity, you can solve that with hiring practices. But when you get to the issue of inclusion, you really need to be able to manage the levers that drive company culture, which is where the recognition aspect that you guys are talking about at Inspirus, Sodexo, really matter. So, getting the culture tuned just right and making sure that the managers are practicing what they preach is critically important. So can you give us and you don't have to name companies, but just an example of the kinds of results you guys have observed with some of your clients with whom you've been able to implement these kinds of programs?
Sure. So when it comes to linking a program together, it's always a great idea to have laid out what that measurement plan is. And I think that one of the best cases that we have utilizing recognition centers around measuring engagement and inclusion in the mix. One of the organizations that we work with has been able to track back that as a result of the recognition efforts that they have in their organization, that they are seeing more innovation amongst their teams, and that additionally those teams that are gender balanced actually drive more innovation than any other team within itself. They are also able to drive higher engagement scores from their teams as well as, as a whole within the organization when they're applying recognition practices. And some of those recognition practices, are as simple as understanding, what employees' personal preferences are, where they're at in their life's journey, what's important to them, and then recognizing when their behaviors are aligning to the goals that have been set out for the organization. So, it could be about taking risks. It could be sharing ideas. It could be, admitting mistakes, failing fast is kind of one of those trends that's out there. But all of those areas are opportunities to measure the impact of the program, and the companies that we work with that have a systematic approach. So it's not a program, it's not a process, but it is a practice that is woven into the values of the organization, into those hiring practices, as you mentioned, all the way into how they recognize and reward, and then ultimately weave it into their performance management systems for success. So those are some of the key successes that we see within the organizations that we work with who link recognition and inclusion together, and some of the ways that they're doing that in the marketplace.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you for taking part in today's podcast. We hope for our listeners this was useful, how you use recognition to help engage your managers and engage your workforce and drive a much more inclusive environment. I want to thank Theresa Harkins-Schulz for once again helping us explain these very complex topics. She's the Senior Vice President of Customer Experience for Inspirus, a Sodexo Group company. Theresa, thanks again, and we hope to have you all tune in for our next HRO Today educational podcast.